Thank you, Marianne, so much for that beautiful and generous introduction. And thank you, Harriet, for thinking of me. We're here in this extraordinary place to celebrate Martin, our friend, our colleague, a visionary, a creator, an initiator, a conversationalist, a man who started arguments, a museum director, an interrogator and thinker about everything, the visual arts, design, opera, theatre, performance, politics, restitution, and cars. The scariest moment in 54 years of my life was being driven by Martin Roth. He was also, amongst other things, Pace Marian, the best-dressed museum director in Europe. And before I went on stage at the V&A, he took me aside, I thought, for some advice, but it was to make sure my tie was straight. Bless you, Martin. He was also a lover of Johnny Cash, hence, I walk the line. Martin was a man who knew about lines, about borders, about frontiers, but he crossed them. He crossed all of those things. And I want to explore this evening with you in this first celebratory lecture about Martin. Something that began as a throwaway conversation with Martin in a corridor. One of those throwaway conversations which always ended up with him saying, "You must do that. You should do that." That's how I remember him. You should do that. And I talked to him about borders and art and the idea of the line. And his finger came to my chest. You should do that. So I'm doing it. Lines, borders, and artists. And in the heart of this idea is the idea of liminality. In limine, that beautiful Latin word, limine, which means threshold. If in limine means something, it means being on the threshold. Many, many interesting, alarming, and scary things happen on the threshold. The threshold is a place of pause, of hesitation. It's a place where you look in and you look back simultaneously. It's where many things are present at one moment, in limine, on the threshold. It's a place of possibility. The border is a place of possibility. And I'm not going to insult you here in Dresden, because you know about borders in a way that so many people in Europe don't, by putting up images of all those contested borders, all those extraordinary and difficult places that we see in the news every day of our life. But where I will start, apart from this image of this well-dressed friend of ours, is to start with the idea of the map. Cultures map the world. Human beings map their place in the world. You go to Lascaux, the caves of Lascaux, and there on the walls, among those extraordinary, storied images of bison and hunting, is an image of the map of the stars, And this beautiful navigational chart from the Marshall Islands, the middle of nowhere in the middle of the Pacific, charts the unimaginable and impossible waters they surround themselves with. You need to map and find your place in the world. And mapping is a good start for this conversation. It can be political, of course it can. It can be poetical, and it can be temporal. It can be amongst time. And mapping isn't liminal, but we start with maps. We start with the way in which artists create maps of the world in a polemical way. I don't know if our guests there can actually see this, but they want to move around. Otherwise, you're going to miss Ai Weiwei's map of China. And this extraordinary sense in which you choose how to map the world. Alighieri e Boetti's extraordinary map of the world created by refugees in Afghanistan. Michael Craig Martin's problematic sense of the world. I'm not quite sure how good your eyesight is, but it's worth paying attention to this map. And then, in homage to another English potter, Grayson's Perry's furious map of an Englishman filled with all the things that the English don't like. It's a very detailed and complicated map, and bears study. The English, it emerges, map themselves through their dislikes very passionately. They don't like anything at all. I'm European. I'd just like to say that out loud. And Vic Muniz's great map using the junk that he found on the streets of New York. And Louise Bourgeois' problematic sense of the horror and worry of France. Look at that smile. You should be worried. But these are perhaps the more obvious mappings of the world. You can map your territory. You can map your place in a slightly more poetic way. And for me, one of the most extraordinary artists to do this, and I'm not sure if any of you have been on pilgrimage to this, is the Library of Water of Ronnie Horn. Ronnie Horn is a very interesting contemporary artist whose obsession with Iceland led her to take glacial water from all round the island and create an extraordinary, beautiful map, a library of glacial water in the middle of nowhere. It's a somewhere, but it's also a nowhere. And you spend time in this extraordinary map of water. And as you move amongst these columns of different kinds of water, you're conscious of how space mapped in the world brings you to an intensely personal story of how you move through space. Sensing the water below the ground can be a way of mapping the world. And it also can be mapped through time. And my great example of this, bear with me, is the extraordinary artist On Kawara, who spent his whole life mapping every single day, sending telegrams round the world saying, "I am still alive," to friends, taking and writing every single day, 1 million years past, an obsessional mapping of time. Why would you do such a thing? Why would you want to map time in that obsessional way? Why would you want to think it's important to record your place in the world in that obsessional way? It's worth bearing in mind that artists throughout the centuries have tried to find and make sense of not only the place they're in, but the time they've spent on this earth, finding that moment, that temporal moment, that extraordinary liminal moment, that threshold moment when time seems to pause. And one of the great revelations of the last 70 years in the West was the experience of looking for the first time and seeing the extraordinary calligraphy of Zen, Chinese, and Japanese calligraphers, where the line, the single line, seemed to express eternity and also that extraordinary, condensed, powerful moment, that moment where one thing happens and is held in time. The revelation of seeing this kind of calligraphy, this kind of line in America after the Second War was profound. It led to a rethinking about gesture and what line might meant. In this beautiful, extraordinary tire print that Robert Rauschenberg did, this scroll, a Zen scroll, but made by inking the tire of his car in downtown Manhattan, and with John Cage pushing this small car down the street to make a 20th century scroll. How mad is that? And how wonderful is that line? You want lines? How about Jack Kerouac's 36-meter scroll manuscript of On the Roll, on the Roll, on the Road? Why would he do a manuscript like that? Because it tells you about a line which is partial and continuous, which keeps on going, where the temporal, that temporal liminal moment keeps on going. You're still on the road. Here is a wonderful picture, I'm afraid out of focus, of it being unrolled. Unfortunately, I know this is being filmed, but it belongs to a rather difficult billionaire, because I tried to borrow it from an exhibition and he said no. Anyway, luckily this is being filmed, or not filmed. But lines. How do you read the line? The line taken from Zen becomes a physical object. It becomes taken by Carl Andre, taken out into the world, taken into the gallery, and it becomes a commodified line. It's still there, but this is a different kind of unwrapping of the line. But there's one artist who I think expresses this idea of walking the line more clearly than anyone else I know. He is an English artist, Richard Long, who, when still a student in 1967, walked across a field, a meadow, and walked back and made his first piece, a line made by walking. And from that fugitive, quiet line of thought has spent the last 50 years making all kinds of borders, all kinds of frontiers, all kinds of lines in different landscapes. They are extraordinary because they're made in this way of being present in time, walking backwards and forwards, a journey, a pilgrimage, a trace, sometimes a palimpsest, where a line is made by moving something and then moving it back again, so that you see only the loss. But wherever he makes his lines, he leaves things as they were. The rocks are moved and then they're taken away again. How extraordinary to think of lines in the landscape in this way. How extraordinary to think that you can make art by rearranging your thoughts through walking, even moving a few stones along a riverbank. And he's promised me a walk this summer, and I'm absolutely terrified. Some of his walks go on for weeks. He's 70 and carries a rucksack I can't even lift. So lines are performative. They can be incredibly beautiful. They can be visceral. Paul McCarthy, a white line painted on the floor with my face. This is performance line making. Here he is, face painting in 1972. You can feel that American stubble and that particular gallery floor. This is a video you may not want to see. Or the performance of running, Martin Creed's work number 852. He was commissioned to make a sculpture for the Tate. The Duveen Hall, a hall not quite as big and splendid as your hall here, I'd like to say, filled often with sculpture, but he took his commission and commissioned runners and members of the public to run through the gallery on the hour, backwards and forwards. A work that is barely there, but is also a line made by running. And that sense of movement, that line of movement, that performance, is something that Martin and I talked about. And I showed him these photographs of Merce Cunningham at Black Mountain College in 1952, photographed the young, wonderful choreographer, beautiful choreographer and dancer, photographed by his friend John Cage, the wonderful polemical artist, composer, creator of happenings. And here is Cunningham being calligraphy. He's being a Zen brushstroke in midair. Isn't this glorious? This is a young American who's seen Zen art and wants to make that brushstroke in the air. And I have to say, delightfully, Martin didn't know these photographs. But, he said, you must know my great friend, Bill Forsyth. And actually, William Forsyth's black flags, shown here across the way to such enormous, powerful effect, is in many ways that feeling of Merce Cunningham's, of making a line, making a body float in air, making something happen where time seems to change in your experience. It is, of course, profoundly political. It is polemical as a work, but it is also deeply, beautifully aesthetic in the way in which bodies and cloth inhabit space. I came for the opening performance of Black Flags here, and I can say truly that it was one of the more extraordinary experiences of my life. But that idea of how lines work, of how borders work, is something that increasingly I have found most clearly expressed in the work of John Cage. John Cage, who grew up on the West Coast, came to music and revealed himself at Black Mountain College in that extraordinary community of artists, Robert Rauschenberg, Cy Twombly, Merce Cunningham, Albers, to be someone who could rethink how lines work. And so he began to make scores, ways of thinking about how sound could be transposed into different kinds of idioms and created in all kinds of ways. It's poetry, he said. It's also experiential. It's the experience that we have when we sit together for 4 minutes and 33, and here is his score: tacet, tacet, tacet. 4 minutes 33, a line of silence, which of course becomes anything but silence. And he went to Japan, and when he saw the great stones of Roanji, that line of beautiful rocks in a rock garden, he started to make visual art too. This is his extraordinary, beautiful rocks that he put down on a piece of paper and made these lines, tracing them obsessionally again and again. And when offered the chance to show an exhibition of new work in Los Angeles, I made a series of works for John Cage, which were oral works. I made aluminium boxes and put pieces of steel, clunk, 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 down in these black boxes, and then wove black porcelain amongst them. It was a piece for John Cage, a piece that came out of this experience of Roanji, this rock garden. And here is the white version. Pieces of marble, pieces of gold, and pieces of porcelain. Now, lines aren't always straight. I'm a minimalist. I move towards straight lines. But lines, as we know, become all kinds of complicated nests and matrices. We walk in circles. And as we map our experiences in the world, we don't always walk in straight lines, like Richard Long, like Carl Andre. We map our world in complicated ways. And when we map our cities, when we map our experiences of where we live, we map them metaphorically and through storytelling. We map them through narrative, through setting out on a story and going round in circles. We read Calvino's beautiful book on Venice, which is a kind of memoir of walking in circles, of endlessly coming back to the same place and finding it different, of being iterative and reiterative, returning. And that idea of returning through walking, of walking in circles, of being entangled in storytelling, is something that in my practice I find very significant, because my own story is a story of walking through cities. It's a story of walking through Odessa, of walking through Paris in the Belle Époque, of walking complicatedly through Vienna, and of walking through Tokyo. My own family story, the story that came back to me through the objects I inherited, in which I wrote as a family story, trying to trace the history of my lost Jewish family through objects, was a story of walking in circles, being entangled in cities and trying to map them. And so my warmth, my heart goes out to anyone who maps cities, who walks as a flaneur walks. A flaneur doesn't walk in a straight line. A flaneur walks and sees what's left on the street. They look into shop windows, they backtrack, and they stop in bars constantly. And the great heroic flaneur of the 20th century is the man who grew up in Berlin at the turn of the last century, Walter Benjamin. And Benjamin was part of my friendship with Martin. You don't know how lonely it is to be an Englishman. When you try and say, I love Walter Benjamin, and you're faced with a wall as grey and black as anything. But with Martin, we were on a journey. And movingly, my last conversation in public with Martin was about Benjamin. Benjamin was the great hero of getting lost. He said in his wonderful memoir of childhood, set in Charlottenburg, that he could get lost on the way to school, that he didn't know his left from his right until he was in his 20s, and that he couldn't read a map. But oh my God, what a man to get lost with. He maps literature. He collects toys and conversations, the first sayings of his son, bus tickets, photographs, books and inscriptions and manuscripts. He records the flaneurs of Paris. He walks and walks those arcades. In exile, he runs and walks the paths of Ibiza and in Denmark, the streets of Paris, the streets of Berlin, all those archives, the Bibliothèque Nationale haunts him. Libraries, more libraries, and streets. And he says, there is a great art, the art of getting lost, Ehrkunst. Because he says it's when you stop walking in a straight line that you begin like a rag picker, to pick up the trifles, the things that are left behind on the street, and you take them home. And that's the beginning of poetry. That's the beginning of storytelling. So in the company of Benjamin, that obsessive maker of lists, that obsessive getter lost in cities, that flaneur, we come endlessly to the idea of what a border might be. And so I had the privilege in Berlin of working with the Benjamin Archive and seeing all these extraordinary notebooks and documents and fragments, those scribbles on bus tickets. And I decided for my exhibition in Berlin that I would take as my central image a wonderful text unpacking my library. He's been on his travels, and finally, the packing cases of his library arrive in his apartment, and he unpacks these cases and takes out one book and then another. And as he handles each book, he tells the story of where he found it, which bookseller he bought it from, which auction he bid against, how he stole it. And so for Walter Benjamin, I made a huge installation of black packing cases. And into this are inserted small places where light comes through, where my black porcelain is lit. Sometimes it's shadowy. Sometimes you can hardly see it's there. But in all these different places, these moments and pauses within these packing cases, they're as high as this screen here. I put black porcelain and let the light come in and let people explore it. And I called the piece Ehrkunst, the art of getting lost. And because it's about reading, because it's about reading objects and discovering them in new ways, encountering objects again and again and finding new ways of looking at them, new ways of exploring them, holding them, seeing them, sensing them, losing them. I also found that I needed to make a library for Walter Benjamin. So, slightly obsessively, I collected every single edition of his work from 1945 in print and made a library in my gallery in Berlin, 280 different editions of his books. And then, for several months, lots of people came and read Benjamin and wrote on the paper and sent letters all around the world. Here they are exploring and getting mystified by my installation. But they all wrote letters round the world about Benjamin, about that Berlin writer, that thinker, that man who knew how to get lost. But here we come to the difficult bit, because the frontier in Benjamin's life was not metaphorical, it was actual. He was Jewish, he was in exile, and in 1940, attempting to cross the Pyrenees into safety, he discovers that his papers are not in order. And terrified and exhausted, after walking and walking and walking his line in a village in the mountains in the Pyrenees called Port-Bou in 1940, he takes his life. He has with him only his attaché case, his briefcase with his notes. And so I made a memorial piece called Port-Bou, which is Corten steel, the heaviest steel you can find, and pieces of porcelain held together in a vitrine as my way of saying with devotion that some borders you come to and you can't cross. Port-Bou, where lines stop. And this takes me to the other person for whom, in our conversations, Martin kept recurring. And that's the poet Celan, Paul Celan. Celan, as many of you will know, was born in Romania with German as his first language. From Jewish family, his family are deported. And in his life in Germany and in Paris, as a translator, as an exile, as a man who kept moving across borders and frontiers and language, his experience of what lines meant kept stopping. He is the poet of the colour white. White is the colour, he says, of the hair of my mother that I'll never see. White is exile. White is the path into nothingness. And white is also the page of his poetry. The poetry where his lines get shorter. They keep stopping. He can't stop stopping. And sometimes he can't even start. He started his lecture, a lecture to say thank you for a medal he was being given. It took him 6 months to write the thank you speech. I look at his manuscripts in Darmstadt, and every single line is crossed out again and again and again. He can't start, and he keeps stopping. And in his beautiful essay about what poetry means, he writes about the pause. He says that all poetry starts with what he calls atem vende, breath turn, the pause between breathing in and breathing out. He says there's a moment between breathing in and breathing out, a pause, which is liminal. It's a threshold. It's a border. And on that threshold, all poetry begins. It is incredibly beautiful to think of the borderline within our own breath, and that is where Celan, the poet of borders, finds solace, difficult solace. And so, when I was invited by my difficult family city of Vienna to make an installation for the Tasius Temple, this white classical pavilion just on the Ringstrasse, 300 yards from where my family lived and where my family were exiled. What do I make for Vienna? I make a poem for Vienna. I make a poem which I call Lichtzwang, after a Celan poem, which is an Atemwende, a breath turn. It has all the different whites of all my different journeys, all those different mappings of the bits of the world. My mapping of China and Dresden and England and of Vienna. And I put this installation up in Vienna. It's there for 4 months. The doors open during the day and people go and drink their beer there. And parents take shelter when it's raining. And it's held there for 4 months. And do you know what? The critics hate it because it's Vienna, and the critics hate everything in Vienna. But for 4 months, I have a poem, Celan, in Vienna, my own border, my own Atemwende in Vienna. And when I come back to London, I realize I need to make one more work. And I make a piece called Black Milk, which comes from Todesfuge. And that goes nowhere near Austria. And that is another conversation. And so I'm going to end with borders, with artists who walk the line. And I'm going to end with this remarkable person, Francis Alice. Here he is doing a green line in Jerusalem. And here he is with his project in Peru. Faith moves mountains. Faith moves mountains. The year 2000, and Peru is in a difficult, perilous situation. And Francis Alice decides that what he's going to do is to ask for 500 volunteers to spend a day with him. And they go up into the mountains outside Lima, 500 people. And for a day, armed only with a shovel, they make a line. They make a border. They decide they're going to move the mountain 2 centimeters. It's completely mad. 500 people, this beautiful, strange, atmospheric line of people doing this obsessional movement of just moving the world a little. And by moving the world a little, they say that faith moves mountains, that you have some control over where your liminality lies, some possibility of thinking about where you want to walk your line. And that's at the heart of Martin's legacy for me. He says, you have agency about where and what line you wish to walk. Straight, crooked, in circles, but cross that boundary, cross that line. Faith moves mountains. And so when my friend moved from here to the V&A, and he was faced with this building, with these closed doors, and with this side entrance, with closed doors, Martin dreamt of a new kind of threshold, a new kind of way in to the museum. Liminal threshold. And this is it. A completely new way into the Victoria and Albert Museum. There are no gates. There are no pillars and steps. You come in to a new public space. And you can gather here, and people do, and they sit, and they have their cups of coffee, and it rains, because it's London, like Dresden. But it's a new way in. And it's porcelain. Thank you. It's a porcelain threshold into the museum. And if you want an image of a place of possibility, a place which is truly liminal, then that surely is an image of our friend. So, dear Dr. Ackerman, dear Harriet, and Masha, and Roman, and Clara in Vancouver, and dear friends, what an invitation, what a privilege to start this series of lectures. And oh my goodness, let's walk his line together. Thank you.